From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. Meet the new Doug Ford, same as the old Doug Ford. As the pandemic continues to rage on, how Ontario reacts and deals with it has become synonymous with our premier. In the early days of the pandemic, longtime watchers of Doug Ford noticed his change in tone, in particular during his daily briefings, although he also always seemed to know when to call a Yahoo a Yahoo.
We want to open it up more, and then you got a bunch of Yahoos again that, number one, hold the party, and then a whole bunch of 200 Yahoos show up to hold the party. Like, guys, what? Like, man, come on. Like, what don't you get?
But as time has gone by, critics of Ford have started to point to some issues that show that the premier is getting back to other business. In particular, a controversy involving a religious school and the increased use of a strong-arm development tool that has conservationists and communities up in arms. Martin Regg Cohn is the Ontario politics columnist at The Star, and he joins us to discuss Doug Ford, his government, and some of the moves they are making during this pandemic. Martin, thanks so much for coming back onto the show.
Pleasure, Raju.
So Martin, one of the reasons that we're having you back on is back in April, we had you on to talk about how the premier had stuck a different tone early on in the pandemic. Let's just start there. I think it was fair to say at the time, but it's been 8 months. Obviously, there's lots of tough decisions. Columnists obviously have the right to change their mind. How would you say that Ford has sort of changed in tone and action from the early part of the pandemic to now?
This is the first time I've ever heard that a columnist is allowed to change their mind. That's great news. No, I'm kidding. Listen, the question we always had is, after Ford had this kind of almost personality transplant at the beginning of the pandemic, was how long would it take? How long would it hold? And at what point would he revert to sort of Doug Ford 1.0 versus 2.0? And I think inevitably every political columnist and every reader knows that a honeymoon never lasts. First honeymoon never lasts, and even the second honeymoon doesn't last. So is it as sweet and perfect as it was? Not perfect, but is it as refreshing as it was at the beginning when Doug Ford was less cantankerous and less partisan and a better listener and more empathetic? I think we still have that. We're just seeing more of reality as well, because all good things can't last forever. So we can talk about this through the show. We are seeing Doug Ford revert to some of the old Doug Ford from time to time on issues of pandering to social conservatives, to not always listening and making the right decision on questions of public health or public engagement. But on balance, it's still a different Doug Ford than came to power 2.5 years ago. That's for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic response. He's taken some heat for some of his moves. How do you think he's doing right now? I mean, this has lasted a lot longer than pretty much anybody probably expected. And yes, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But Ford, on the whole, he's done pretty good, especially compared to some other premiers, right?
Well, I think that's the benchmark. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Has he been perfect? Of course not. But you have to compare him. You don't have to, but it's useful to benchmark him to other large jurisdictions, not small jurisdictions like Newfoundland or New Zealand or the maritime provinces, where it's easier to control stuff. But the large jurisdictions, and remember, the big superstar at the outset was California. Now it's a mess. Germany was a big model. Now it's out of control. France, other countries, Israel initially was a star performer. So if you're a large jurisdiction, there's a lot of things you can't control. And certainly the Western provinces, British Columbia was kind of the poster child. And now it has all kinds of problems. So let's look at what you can control. You can control or try to have your own model for schools. A lot of people over the summer, I wasn't really one of them, were very worried about how Doug Ford was going to allocate resources to the school reopening. Turns out that Ontario went further than any other province in the country in terms of mandating masks for kids, starting at grade 3. Now, my only regret is that as a columnist, I wish I had said, look, you should go further. You should make sure that kids in kindergarten are wearing masks. But I was kind of scratching my head. My kids are a little older now. They're teenagers. And wondering, can we really force kids in grade 1 to wear masks? But certainly, by starting at grade 3, Ontario was going further than any other province. Well, it turns out Ontario changed its mind and a few days later said, we're going to make every kid in every grade, starting in kindergarten, wear a mask if they possibly can.
Well, I go with the experts at Sick Kids. They're the ones who didn't recommend masks. They said they'd be fiddling around with the masks. And, I had 4 girls. I know when they were little, when they're 4 years old, 5 years old, it's hard to keep the mask on them. But again, we'll be there. We'll support the board if that's what they want to do. But keeping a mask on a JK or senior kindergarten might be difficult, but we'll support it.
And guess what? It's working. And guess what? Other provinces are catching up. Now, that doesn't mean Ontario is an all-star, but I just think we need some perspective when we talk about openings and closings and masking and unmasking, because a lot of other provinces, a lot of other countries are playing catch up.
Okay, there are a number of other issues to talk about, and I think that there's one that, you've written quite a bit about. And while there are some things that we can assign to sort of the Ford government, the one that's really being sort of driven by the premier and has caused issues with his party is the Charles McVety affair. Now, this is a little complicated, but basically the government planted giving degree-granting powers to the controversial Canadian Christian College, and in a budget bill. But this is pretty much in part due to his relationship with the founder, who has also been fairly controversial. Why is Ford doing this? Something that clearly people in his party aren't really on board with.
Yeah, and let's be a little more specific about Charles McVety. This is the president of Canada Christian College, which doesn't have university status. It's been in trouble historically under his father. It lost its right to grant degrees in the early 1980s in certain fields because the Bill Davis government, also progressive conservative, was concerned about academic standards and safeguarding Ontario's reputation. Fast forward to Charles McVety, and so this is a person who has been sanctioned by the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council for his hurtful and bigoted comments about gays. So he is known to be, and has from time to time used some very vulgar and homophobic comments. Equally, he has made Islamophobic comments, just slagging Islam in quite objectionable and bigoted ways. So that's who we're dealing with in the first place. In the second place, it's a college that has some problems with credibility. And part of the reporting that we've published in the Star is that a provincial regulator that's in charge of psychotherapy, the College of Registered Psychotherapists, has written in some of his decisions that this college doesn't produce graduates who are up to standards in the field of psychotherapy. And there were problems even with the credibility of the transcripts that the college was issuing. So there's all kinds of problems. To your question, why would the Premier of Ontario dance with this partner who is of questionable reputation and whose college has a questionable reputation, where questions are being raised at least? And the answer, I think, is that they have a relationship that goes a little bit back to when Doug Ford was running for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party. And as you know, Raju, the old playbook is to dance with social conservatives. Social conservatives means a bit of political jargon. It's people who are pro-life, sometimes are reluctant to give equal rights to gays, LGBTQ+, and who are opposed to gay marriage. It's a basket of issues. And Doug Ford got their support early on in his leadership campaign by promising to review the sex education curriculum that had been updated by Kathleen Wynne when she was premier of the last Liberal government, and who took a lot of shots from Charles McVety for being Ontario's first lesbian premier. People were saying, oh, she has some kind of top secret hidden agenda. I've said too much already. So why did Ford do this? It's a political IOU, it looks like, from the outside, that he felt he had to repay Charles McVety for that political debt. And one way to do that was to try to recommend in his legislation, this budget bill, this omnibus bill, this grab bag of items, to say, let's upgrade them to university status and allow them to issue BA and BSc degrees. That's a Bachelor of Science issued by a soon-to-be university, perhaps, whose president doesn't even believe in evolution.
This just sounds really, really crazy. But the other thing is, that omnibus bill is basically passed, right? I mean, there's still some hoops to jump through, but this is on its way, right?
You're right. There are hoops to jump through. That's a good way of putting it, because without getting too down in the weeds, the government, under pressure from people saying, hey, why are you doing this? This just sounds insane. Why are you recommending this college for university status when there are so many questions? And the answer is the government said, look, don't worry. We have legislation to grant them university status, but we won't ask the lieutenant governor to proclaim it into law, to enact it, until after it's been reviewed by an outside independent panel, which is called the Post-Secondary Education Quality Assessment Board. You can make up an acronym, PCAP. And they take months to do these things. So it's a big bureaucratic rabbit hole that this has been sent into. Do I think that this outside board of panelists, which is, all these poor experts, are going to be dragged in to evaluate and assess a Bible college that clearly doesn't merit university status on the evidence? And eventually this will disappear. But the government, or at least the premier, can now say to Charles McVety, hey, I put through this legislation that granted you university status contingent on getting outside approval, which will never happen.
We aren't going to proclaim the legislation until everything goes through the proper processes. We're going to follow the procedures like we do to anyone else, and that's the only fair thing to do.
So we're all dancing in circles, chasing our tails. And at the end of the day, I don't think they'll get university status. I think the premier, to your first question, has damaged his reputation and appears to have reverted to the old Doug Ford, at least in this instance. And I think he wishes this will go away as fast as possible, and even within his caucus, because it's a relatively diverse caucus. You know, there are some Muslims, there are some people from visible minorities, the usual distribution of the population, and a lot of them aren't happy, have told me that they don't like this either because it goes against the pluralism and the tolerance that many of us in Canada and many progressive conservatives believe in.
We'll be right back. Martin, the other really, really big one is this government's use of ministerial zoning orders, or MZOs. The Star has done some extensive coverage on this. This is going to be sort of a big question, but, this is one of these things where many environments and communities are crying foul because, we should first talk about how rare their usage has been in the past. But the other aspect here is the green belt. This has been sort of the third rail of Ontario politics and the vision of conservation here. Ford's actions have spurred a number of resignations from the Greenbelt Council, including David Crombie. There's also the famous video of him proclaiming that he was going to open it up to developers.
We will open up the Greenbelt, not all of it. We're going to open a big chunk of it up, and we're going to start building and making it more affordable and putting more houses out there.
What is happening here?
Yeah, that was Doug Ford 1.0, where he was saying, again, in his leadership campaign, or it might have been after he won the leadership and it was pre-campaign, pre-election campaign. And he was it was a fundraising meeting behind closed doors, but oops, there was a video camera. And he said, yeah, we got to solve the housing crisis by opening up the Greenbelt. Got the Greenbelt to build homes. And then that came out and he said, oh, no, I won't do that. And so promise made, oops, promise not kept, because they are fiddling with the Greenbelt now. You're right that the Greenbelt is the third rail, but as a columnist, I sometimes think the Greenbelt is a hard sell for readers because some people are really passionate about it. Some people's eyes glaze over. What's interesting here is that just like with the Charles McVety case in Canada Christian College, the dissension and the criticism and the unhappiness is also internal to the Progressive Conservative Party. People don't like what they see. And, when your own people turn on you, David Crombie is an illustrious progressive conservative. Okay, he's a red Tory, but he's still a Tory. And he's a true believer in conservatism, which used to include environmentalism, preserving the environment, preserve it and conserve it, as they used to say. And when he resigns, and he's not alone, there were 6 others who resigned from the Greenbelt authorities and conservation authorities, including some other conservatives who also talked about Brian Mulroney, Canada's perhaps greenest prime minister, talked about Jean Charest, a former environment minister for Mulroney and premier of Quebec, who safeguarded the environment. So there are Tories who are true believers in the environment, and they're not happy about what they're seeing. And so in a way, that's a story we can all understand when Tories turn on Tories about the environment. Because it's not a partisan motivation here. It's not some kind of fight about ideology. It's the ecology. It's people saying, this is not right. So people see David Crombie as a straight shooter. And so in a way, he's a proxy for this issue. If you don't know the niceties of the Greenbelt and the ins and outs of conservation authorities and floodplains, and you have this vague idea that you don't want bulldozers all around encircling the GTA, people will trust David Crombie as telling them the truth, telling it as it is. And his resignation letter was pretty strong stuff. He said, words to the effect that this is not fiddling with policy revisions. This is bombing. It's like a carpet bombing of the Greenbelt. That's not a good thing. And again, that's a story I think people can understand.
So I think the thing that some critics are saying is he's trying to undertake these controversial moves under the cover of a pandemic. I think you're saying he's reverting a bit to more classic Doug Ford. Is it a mix of both? What do you think is happening here?
Everyone reverts. I still revert to childishness in my old age. It's just natural. So you can't expect over 8 months Doug Ford to be a paragon of virtue any more than any other politician is. In terms of what I agree with you, though, about is that sometimes these things are happening under cover of COVID. They are hoping that people won't notice. And the best example of that, without going into a rabbit hole, is the budget bill. It's no accident that some of the things we talked about, Canada Christian College, for example, but that's what unites these issues, Canada Christian College and the Greenbelt, both questions that caused dissension within the Progressive Conservative Caucus or the Progressive Conservative movement, and also were thrown together in this grab bag of budgetary housekeeping measures, which we call in politics an omnibus bill. Bit of a dirty word, omnibus bill. It's also a bit of jargon, but basically it's a grab bag where you throw all kinds of things together that are unrelated to each other. The granting of degrees and diplomas and the green belt and budget supply measures, budget cash flow, all thrown together. People can't notice all. It's hard to keep track of all these things. It's hard to focus people. And then you throw in a pandemic, and that's what people talk about when they say that, yeah, he's hoping people won't notice. Guess what? They did. And who noticed most of all? His own progressive conservatives cried foul. And that's instructive for the rest of us who are journalists and trying to figure out what's really happening behind closed doors.
I think the really interesting thing is, despite criticism on a number of fronts, and you mentioned this when we talked about comparing him to other jurisdictions, but let's compare him to other conservative premiers. He's still faring a lot better than some of his Western counterparts. And the two I can point to is Brian Pallister and Jason Kenney. What do you think about that? And also, the idea that I believe there are people out west that are looking lovingly at Doug Ford.
And not just out in the West. It's funny, there was a Liberal member of the National Assembly in Quebec who tweeted out a few months ago, golly, I wish we could, he didn't say golly, but he pointed to Doug Ford and said, if only Quebec were as agile as Ontario's Doug Ford in coping with the pandemic and back to school plans. So look, this is not the Doug Ford cheerleading department at the Toronto Star. It's not what we're famous for, but I think we're trying to be fair about it and give readers some perspective and context. So if you talk about the pandemic and COVID, right, if you look at Manitoba, if you look at Alberta in particular, Jason Kenney, who won in a landslide a year or two ago and who had enormous personal popularity, he was so rigid and so disappointing in terms of his almost American style. I'm not going to say Trump style, but American style adherence to individual freedoms and worrying excessively, overthinking the whole mask mandate. I mean, we're in a public health emergency. And, I'm not going to lecture people about masks. It's like secondhand smoke. It's about protecting everybody else and yourself. And Jason Kenney got hung up on that. I think he got paralyzed with fear that he would be outflanked by fringe right-wingers in his province. Let's analyze Doug Ford through this lens. Doug Ford could have spent his time worrying about extreme right-wingers. He could have worried about, say, Randy Hillier, who has been expelled from his caucus and who has been leading a bit of an anti-mask movement. Doug Ford could have cowered and worried that he would be seen as a softie and a pinko and everything else. And he didn't. He actually shouted down the yahoos in so many words, not literally shouting them down, but he called them yahoos. He came up with colorful language that I cannot even replicate. Something about, two fries short of a Big Mac or something. I'll have to go look it up. I know he was beside the Premier of Quebec who was marveling at Ford's idiomatic English. But Jason Kenney and Doug Ford are an instructive comparison about how two conservatives responded to the pandemic. One of them, Jason Kenney, responded true to form and got hung up on individual freedoms instead of the collective good in a time of a public health emergency. I repeat, a public health emergency. The other one, Doug Ford, hasn't been perfect, but has done more or less the right political moves of, yes, listening to medical advice. There's a lot of second guessing from some epidemiologists, from some political pundits about whether Doug Ford is out of control and shutting down epidemiology and seat of the pants and listening to business. Candidly, those of us who are at Queen's Park and talk to people on all sides of the equation don't quite see that. We see somebody who's taken kind of a middle course. There are things that he could have done more. I personally think that churches and houses of worship and synagogues and temples should have been tamped down a lot earlier because you can pray from home, without throwing people out of work. And of course, fellowship is important. But on the other side, indoor restaurants, complicated issue, not seen necessarily as a driver of infections. It's a very complicated template. So to your original question, yeah, I think Doug Ford on the evidence is doing the best he is capable of and has tried to steer a middle course throughout.
Martin, this has been fantastic for us. I think we're going to wrap up here. But quickly, you're working on something special for your next column. What's that?
Yeah, Christmas is coming. The holiday season is looming. And for Saturday's column, which will be online, I hope later Friday, I'm doing my annual Toronto Star Santa Claus Fund column. And I thought, I'm going to do something political about it. Not really political. So I've reached out to a whole bunch of premiers, Mike Harris, David Peterson, Kathleen Wynne, Ernie Eves, Bob Ray, and Doug Ford, and asked them, what do you think about the Santa Claus Fund? What does it mean to you? And what about gift giving at this time of year? A very tough Christmas. And so, Reggie, a bit of a Christmas miracle. I think I've got a whole bunch of premiers of different political persuasions all on the same page, literally and figuratively speaking, in Saturday's Toronto Star. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, it's a Christmas miracle. Martin, thank you so very, very much for your time today. Always a pleasure.
You take care. Bye for now.
Martin Regg Cohn is the Ontario politics columnist at The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajat Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.